She paid for her seat. She earned her stripes. But still someone leaned in and said, "Ma'am, this section isn't for you." Rosa was 72, a black war nurse who'd carried dying soldiers on her back while the nation slept in peace. But here, in the velvet aisle of first class, she was seen as a mistake, a disruption, a woman too old, too black, too out of place. The cabin watched, silent. Phones didn't rise. No voices spoke up. Only Rosa did. She didn't move. She didn't argue. She simply stayed seated, and that's when everything changed. Rosa Williams did not simply board that plane she entered, as if she were walking back into a country she once served, uncertain whether it would still recognize her. At 72, she moved not slowly but deliberately, each step steady with the kind of quiet resilience that cannot be taught. Her spine was straight, her breath calm, her presence unassuming yet undeniable. If you saw her from across the terminal, you might not have noticed. She was dressed modestly, gray trousers, polished shoes, a faded navy coat that once belonged to her late husband. But if you looked closely, you'd see something else, a quiet storm behind her eyes, not of bitterness, but of memory. She had been a combat nurse, 3 tours, Panama, Bosnia, Afghanistan. Her hands had held trembling soldiers. Her voice had steadied boys barely old enough to shave. Her body had knelt in mud and gunfire to keep strangers alive. In the chaos of battlefield trauma, she didn't flinch. She didn't freeze. She made decisions. She stopped bleeding. She saved lives. For over 2 decades, she was the final thread between a man and his mother's voice, between blood loss and one more sunrise. Rosa never asked for recognition. She didn't collect medals, but the military sent them anyway, sometimes without ceremony, sometimes months late. She kept them all in a wooden box at home, beneath a folded flag and one handwritten letter from her husband that she still carried everywhere she went. He had written it the week before his unit deployed to Iraq. "If you outlive me," it said, "don't let the world make you small. You've seen too much. You've given too much. Make sure they remember." He never came back. That letter became her anchor. When grief came like a flood, it steadied her. When the country moved on, it reminded her of what still mattered. Rosa had done more than serve. She had invested in people, in causes, and eventually in business. After retiring, she used her military pension and savings to purchase shares in Liberty Wings, an airline she believed in, not because it was glamorous, but because it employed thousands of veterans like her. She became a primary shareholder, not for power, but for principle. She believed dignity didn't end with duty, it extended into how we treat each other in ordinary places, like airport gates, like row 2, seat A. That morning, Rosa's boarding pass led her to first class, not as a reward, not as an indulgence, but as a quiet testament to a life of earned worth. She arrived early, walked the jet bridge slowly, smiled at the attendant who didn't look up. When she reached her seat, a man in a tailored suit was already there, sprawled across 2 places, legs wide, briefcase on the cushion beside him. He didn't acknowledge her, not at first, not until she said, "Excuse me, I believe that's my seat." He looked at her the way a person glances at a shadow that got too close. "This is first class," he said flatly, as if it were a code she didn't know. "You sure you're in the right section?" She held out her boarding pass, polite but firm. "Yes, seat 2 amperes." He leaned back, crossed his arms. "Maybe someone made a mistake," he said. "You don't look like you belong here." She had heard those words before, not always spoken aloud, but always there. She had heard them when she applied to nursing school in Alabama, when she was told no one wanted to be treated by a black woman. She had heard them in field hospitals, when junior officers refused her orders until they saw her hand stop a hemorrhage. She had heard them in boardrooms, in banks, in quiet grocery store lines, where being elderly and black meant invisible. But Rosa didn't raise her voice. She never had to. She simply said, "Sir, I've earned this seat more than once in my life, and I will sit in it now." A hush settled over the cabin. Passengers peeked from behind newspapers, and earbuds paused. A young flight attendant approached, white, early 20s, clearly uncomfortable. "Ma'am, Let me recheck your ticket, she said, eyes flicking toward the man. Rosa handed it over without hesitation. Her name was printed there in bold. Rosa L. Williams, seat 2 amperes, Liberty Wings priority. Then another voice cut through. Wait, are you the Rosa Williams from the 43rd Medical Unit? Everyone turned. A second flight attendant, black, older, her hands trembling slightly. My mother told me about you. She said you once kept her alive for 3 days during a power failure in Bosnia. Rosa looked at her. Recognition came slowly, then steadily. She had a shrapnel wound to the leg, Rosa said. Tried to walk before I cleared her for it. Stubborn woman. The attendant's eyes welled up. She never forgot you. Everything changed. Passengers whispered. Someone Googled her name. A man across the aisle stood and offered his seat. The man in Rosa's place said nothing, but his shoulders sank. He moved. Not because he was told to, but because suddenly everyone saw her. Later, the moment would go viral. Not because of the confrontation, but because of the quiet way Rosa reclaimed her place. The video showed no shouting, no chaos, just a woman standing in front of a seat she had earned and refusing to let the world shrink her. It reminded people of something they had almost forgotten, that dignity doesn't ask. It simply exists. And when it is denied, it waits, unflinching, until it is recognized again. That day, Rosa sat in 2 amperes with her coat folded across her lap and the letter from her husband in her hand. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. She already knew how it ended. The truth of it was written in the way the cabin grew quiet around her, in the space that finally made room for someone who never stopped giving. She didn't want special treatment, just a seat, a place to breathe, a moment of stillness after a life of storms. She got it, and we got a story we'll never forget. Because sometimes the person we overlook is the one who held the line when no one else could. And sometimes dignity doesn't look like a medal. It appears to be an older woman standing tall in an aisle, refusing to budge, because she already did. For all of us. The cabin was quiet when Rosa entered, calm in the way a room gets when something different walks in. She moved slowly, but with the certainty of someone who had arrived not by accident, but by right. At 72, her back remained straight, her eyes observant, her presence wrapped in a calm earned not through privilege, but through years of service, loss, and unspoken resilience. She wasn't dressed to impress. She had never been a navy coat, pressed slacks, polished flats, but there was something about her that made people glance twice, and then look away, something they couldn't name, but felt. See 2 amperes. She found it quickly. Though not by reading the numbers, she had memorized the layout of planes decades ago, back when she had flown with the military in medical transports, holding pressure against a wound, while the engines screamed above war-torn skies. Back when seating wasn't about luxury, but survival. Today was supposed to be simple. A flight, a quiet return, but someone was already in her place. A man sat there mid-50s, white, expensive in the way that suggests boardrooms and cocktail lounges. His suit hugged his frame like it had been tailored around his ego. He had taken both seats, one for himself, one for his briefcase. A blanket spread across the row like a claim, as if territory was still something men like him had the right to declare. He didn't look at her. Not yet. She paused. Then, softly, clearly, "Excuse me, I believe you're in my seat." Now this. He didn't move, didn't even flinch. Instead, he offered the kind of smile that wasn't meant to welcome but to dismiss. "I need the whole row to stretch. You might be more comfortable in the back." She waited. "I fly this route every week," he continued, as if routine were a currency that could buy his way out of accountability. "I'm a preferred client." Rosa lifted her boarding pass, the quiet authority in her fingertips. "This is my seat. 2 amperes. He looked at it, briefly, then back at her. His gaze lingered a second too long. "You sure? It's just not typical." "Not typical, you know. They don't usually..." He stopped short, but the sentence had already spoken for itself. "They don't usually put people like you up here." She had heard it all before, spoken in boardrooms with polished civility, or muttered under breath by young soldiers, unsure of how to take orders from a black woman in uniform. She had heard it in banks, in schools, at hospital desks. Age had not dulled its sting. It had only made her more fluent in its many dialects. The silence around them thickened. Passengers nearby pretended to be asleep. Others stared at their phones, but you could feel them listening. The end that wrapped itself around an injustice, just in case it got interesting. The kind of silence that allows cruelty to stretch out, comfortable in the knowledge it won't be interrupted. Rosa didn't raise her voice. She had learned long ago that volume was not what commanded a room. It was conviction. Her words were steady. I didn't come here to argue. I came to sit where I belong. The man scoffed. Come on, look, just take another seat and let it go. Here's Dawn. A young flight attendant stepped in, her voice hesitant. Sir, I can help you find your assigned seat. He cut her off. Do you even know who I am? Rosa tilted her head just slightly. Do you? He blinked. A pause. Then, from the far end of the cabin, another voice. Wait, is that Rosa Williams? It came from a woman, another flight attendant, older, her voice trembling not from fear, but from recognition. I've seen your picture. You're the nurse from the 43rd. My father, he used to talk about you. Said he wouldn't have made it through Bosnia without your hands on his chest. The air shifted. Passengers who had been silent now began to murmur. A man pulled out his phone. Another leaned forward to see. The attention that had once watched for drama now searched for meaning. The man in Rosa's seat looked around, unsettled. What is this? A history lesson? No, Rosa replied. It's a reminder. He stood, finally, but without apology. He didn't look at her, just gathered his things and moved, as if what had happened hadn't happened at all. But everyone saw it. They saw the way he avoided her gaze. They saw the way Rosa sat, not triumphant, not vindicated, just whole. She took her seat slowly, placed her coat on her lap, and then she did something small. She reached into her bag and took out an envelope, not to read it, just to hold it. The paper was soft from years of folding. Inside was a letter from her husband, gone now. A man who had told her decades ago, one day you'll walk into a room that doesn't want you there. Walk in anyway. She never stopped walking. Around her, the cabin settled. The crew resumed their duties. The hum of the engine filled the silence. But something was different. People sat straighter, watched her, not with pity, but with the uncomfortable reverence we reserve for those who quietly expose the flaws in our comfort. Rosa didn't ask for reverence. She had only asked for a seat. But what she got without shouting, without shaming, was something much bigger. She got the room to see for herself, and once you've seen, you don't unsee. Not the woman, not the silence, not the weight of a life lived with grace, where grace was never guaranteed. And maybe, just maybe, that's how change begins. Not with noise, but with a woman who won't move, because she already did, for all of us. The air inside the cabin had changed, though no one could say exactly when. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. But something had shifted, like the subtle tremble before thunder, when you feel in your chest that something's about to break, not violently, but undeniably. Rosa sat quietly in seat 2 amperes, her presence now impossible to ignore, her silence heavier than a shout. The man who had claimed her seat now sat 1 row behind her, less a victor than a man who had misread the terrain, still stunned that his usual tactics had failed to buy him silence. Around them, the other passengers remained quiet, not out of apathy, but out of uncertainty. There was an ache in the air, as if everyone knew they had witnessed something wrong but weren't sure how to begin making it right. That was when the voice came. Wait, I know that face. It was soft, surprised, almost like the first words of a forgotten prayer. A young flight attendant, no older than 30, stood just a few rows away, holding a service tray in one hand and her breath in the other. She stepped forward slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to realization to a look of reverence. She stared at Rosa, as if history had just risen from the pages of her childhood and taken a seat in front of her. "Are you Rosa Williams?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Rosa looked up. as ever, her eyes steady. Yes, I am. The attendant took a slow breath. My mother. She told me about you. About the nurse who stayed by her brother's side after the bombing in Tuzla. She said you held his hand when they thought he wouldn't make it. She said he survived because of the way you spoke to him, the way you never left. A hush fell again, but this time it was different. It wasn't silence from avoidance. It was silence from reverence. From the slow, collective realization that the woman who had just been humiliated, insulted, displaced, was in fact a living archive of courage. Rosa gave the softest nod, as if remembering something buried so long ago it had lost its edges. He called me Sergeant Sunshine, she said gently, because I used to sing to him in the dark. The attendant blinked back tears. That was my uncle. He named his first daughter after you. Someone gasped. A woman placed a hand over her chest. The man in row 3 leaned forward, a look of stunned surprise on his face. People weren't just hearing a story. They were experiencing it. They were stepping into one. The cabin had become a kind of sacred space, where the ordinary rules of space and time no longer applied. The woman in 2 amperes was no longer anonymous. She was living proof of all the good the world tries to forget too quickly. And then, as if drawn by instinct, Jasmine, the lead attendant, came forward. Her eyes scanned Rosa's face, and recognition dawned like a sunrise after a storm. I studied you, she said quietly. In nursing school, they showed us photos from Bosnia. I remember your hands. I remember the way you carried a boy twice your size through a field of glass. Rosa smiled, but said nothing. The passengers, once passive observers, now watched with the quiet awe of people witnessing justice find its voice, not through punishment, not through outrage, but through memory, through gratitude, through the slow, soft thunder of truth rising to the surface. The man in row 3, the same man who had tried to take Rosa's seat, shifted, uneasy, but this time there was no space left for his discomfort to hide in. The cabin no longer belonged to men like him. It belonged to those who had earned their place through acts no wealth could replicate. Jasmine turned, looked at the man, and spoke not with anger but with gravity. Sir, this woman deserves more than an apology. She deserves the seat. She deserves the silence. She deserves the honor. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The captain emerged from the cockpit. He had heard what was happening through the whispers passed down the aisle, through the energy in the air that had shifted from stillness to reckoning. He approached Rosa with a quiet dignity, looked her in the eyes, and said, Ma'am, on behalf of this airline and every life your hands have touched, thank you. We fly today because people like you walk through storms and never stopped. Rosa, still composed, nodded once. I've flown through worse. No one laughed, but the collective exhale was palpable. The atmosphere had lightened, not because the weight had been lifted, but because it had finally been acknowledged. The truth had spoken, not through a microphone, not through protest, but through story. And the story had a face, a name, a seat, Rosa. Someone began to clap, softly at first. Then others joined, not thunderous, not performative. We see you now, and we apologize for the delay. Jasmine knelt by Rosa's seat and reached for her hand. My mother always said the world would try to forget women like you. That's why I became a nurse, to keep the story alive. Rosa looked out the window. The sky was beginning to shift into a deeper blue. The plane hadn't left the ground, but something else had taken off, something deeper than altitude. The possibility that dignity, when remembered and recognized, can still resonate through a room and awaken it. And as Rosa sat back, calm and quiet, she didn't think about revenge or validation. She thought about the boy she had sung to, the letters she had written for dying soldiers who couldn't hold a pen, the medals she had refused to hang on her wall. And she thought, maybe this time, the world would remember what quiet strength looked like. Maybe this time, they wouldn't forget her name. Not today. Not anymore. By the time the plane touched down, the story had already taken flight. The passengers stepped off into the terminal, still wrapped in a silence that wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent. No one had said much after the moment passed on board, but they all carried the same thing off that flight. they'd seen something that would stay with them longer than their destination ever could. Rosa strolled, as always, but something had shifted. People moved out of her way, not out of pity or condescension, but out of respect, the kind that isn't taught in training manuals, the kind you feel in your bones when you know you're in the presence of someone who deserves it. One young man who had seen everything stayed behind and uploaded the moment to his social page. Not for likes, not for attention. He didn't even tag anyone. Just the caption, "This is what grace looks like." That post traveled, quietly at first, then like wildfire. Not loud, not scandalous, but steady passed from one friend to another, one family to another, until living rooms across the country began to replay it. They didn't see drama. They saw their mothers, their aunts, their grandmothers. They saw the women who had wiped their brows when they were sick, who worked the late shifts, who kept photo albums filled with names few remembered. They saw dignity, and they realized how easy it had become to forget. The clip made it to a local news channel by sundown. By the next morning, Rosa Williams was a household name again, not for what she had done decades ago on the battlefield, but for what she had done in silence on a commercial flight from Dallas to New York. The airlines responded swiftly. But this time, it wasn't just damage control. Something in their tone, something in the faces of the board members who met that evening, suggested this time they were listening. They began by calling her. Rosa didn't answer at first. She wasn't interested in the press. She didn't want compensation. But when they called again and simply said, "We're sorry and we'd like to listen," she picked up. It started small. A private apology. A request to meet. A statement was released with her name printed respectfully, followed by a commitment to review their training and internal policies. But that wasn't the end. The movement continued because people wouldn't let it come to an end. Not the veterans who started gathering outside airport terminals holding signs with her name. Not the nurses who printed out her photo and placed it on their break room bulletin boards. Not the grown children who looked into their mother's eyes and for the first time asked her what she had given up to survive. A televised interview followed. Rosa agreed to one and only one. She sat across from a seasoned journalist who had covered wars, elections, and scandals. He opened his notepad, ready to dig. But Rosa didn't give him sound bites. She gave him memory. She spoke slowly. Her voice didn't quiver. She didn't talk about herself as a hero. She mentioned that many nurses didn't return. She spoke about what it was like to hold the hand of a 20-year-old boy in the last moments of his life while pretending not to cry. She talked about dignity not as a thing owed, but as something every human being carries, even when others refuse to see it. The clip went viral, but in a different way. Not like celebrity gossip, more like a prayer. The airline invited her to return, this time not as a passenger, but as a guest of honor. They held a ceremony in the main terminal, unveiled a commemorative seat, just one, set beside a plaque with her name and a single quote beneath it. "Let the world see what quiet courage looks like." They named the project the Rosa Williams Initiative, a company-wide movement aimed at honoring elders in aviation, nursing, and veteran service. But the ripple didn't stop there. High schools began inviting local veterans to speak at assemblies. Universities began re-evaluating how they taught military history, not just the generals, but also the medics, nurses, cooks, and women who stood quietly behind the men and sometimes in front of them when it mattered most. Talk shows didn't just report her story, they also shared it. They asked bigger questions. What else have we forgotten? Who else have we silenced? Rosa never asked for any of it. She stayed home most days, replying to letters with her handwriting that had begun to tremble ever so slightly. Her front porch had become a quiet sanctuary for reflection, and sometimes for strangers who simply wanted to express their gratitude. She didn't host them, she didn't entertain them, but she always listened. And when one little boy, 9 years old, blonde hair, freckles across his cheeks, showed up with his father and said, "My grandma was a nurse too," Rosa smiled in the way only a woman who has seen death and still chooses life can smile. She placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Then I know you come from good people." Later that evening, the boy boy's father posted a photo of Rosa sitting in her chair on the porch, with the boy kneeling beside her, his hand in hers. The caption read, "There are moments when history sits still long enough for us to say thank you. Today was one." In the weeks that followed, Rosa's story wasn't trending anymore. It wasn't viral, it was just remembered. And for her, that was enough. Because Rosa never wanted to be famous. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to be respected. And maybe, most of all, she wanted to make sure that the next time a woman like her sat quietly in 2 amperes, no one would dare ask her to move. Not because of who she had saved, but because of who she already was. She did not want the camera crews. She never craved the headlines, invitations, or flowers left at her doorstep. Rosa had never needed applause to believe in the worth of her life. For decades, she had lived as millions of women like her did, serving quietly, working tirelessly, enduring silently. And when she sat in that seat on the plane, refusing to give way to a man who couldn't see beyond her skin or her age, she wasn't asking to be seen. She was simply asking not to be erased. What followed surprised even her. She did not expect the young woman who'd once studied her wartime medical cases to burst into tears mid-flight. She did not expect the clip to travel so far, so fast. She certainly did not expect strangers to line her walkway with candles, or handwritten letters, or framed photos of women long past grandmothers, mothers, mentors who had never been acknowledged, but had changed lives all the same. And yet, it kept coming, a tide of memory, long buried under speed and convenience and digital noise, rushes back to the surface. But through it all, Rosa remained the same. She did not go on tour. She did not write a memoir. She spent her mornings tending to her hydrangeas, her afternoons writing letters by hand, and her evenings on the porch with the same quiet she had always known. Her silence wasn't a retreat. It was discipline. Rosa knew better than most that some things grow best in stillness. One day, a journalist called and asked, "Why didn't you ask for justice?" She said nothing at first. Then, with her voice even and steady, she replied, "Justice isn't something I asked for. It's something I carry." Her words weren't defiance. They were true, and they hit deeper than outrage ever could. That's what separated her from so many others. Rosa had nothing to prove. She wasn't performing. She wasn't building a brand or making a statement. She was simply living by the same rules she had always believed in. That dignity does not belong to the loudest voice, or the most polished resume, or the person who demands the seat. Dignity belongs to the life you've lived, and that alone should be enough. As her story spread, so did reflection. In coffee shops and those inner tables, people began remembering the nurse who sat with them through a difficult diagnosis. The neighbor who lost her son overseas but still brought cookies to the church bake sale. The mother who stitched the same coat year after year so her kids could afford books. Rosa's moment reminded them that behind every great accomplishment is someone the world forgot to thank. The airline's reforms were fundamental. They rewrote protocols. They rewired training. They partnered with elder advocacy groups and allocated a budget to enhance accessibility for aging passengers. But Rosa never saw those things as a victory. For her, the fundamental shift happened in how people looked at each other afterward. How, at baggage claim, a stranger helped an older man retrieve his suitcase without being asked. How, at a gas station outside Omaha, a cashier called a woman ma'am, not mockingly but with reverence. How, in the letters she received from people she'd never met, there was the common thread of a single sentence: "I see you now." One letter, written in looping script on blue stationery, came from a retired teacher in Ohio. It read, "My daughter showed me your video, and I cried, not because of the seat, because you reminded me that I mattered. I taught for 42 years. I thought nobody noticed. Thank you for letting me believe I wasn't invisible." And Rosa read that letter, placed it beside the others in her worn cedar box, and exhaled, not because she needed validation, but because she understood something few ever do, that millions are not seeing the most incredible power in the world. It's being seen truthfully by one. As weeks passed, attention faded, as attention always does. However, True legacy does not need to be maintained. It simply remains. Rosa's name stopped trending, but her image became a quiet icon, not plastered across billboards, but framed on mantels and saved in hearts and held in memory. One Sunday afternoon, as autumn leaves gathered on the edge of her steps, a small girl with dark braids and pink glasses walked up to her porch with her grandfather. She looked nervous, holding a drawing in both hands. It was a sketch of Rosa, seated serenely, with a halo of flowers surrounding her. The girl handed it over and whispered, "I drew you like an angel. My papa says you are one." Rosa smiled gently and said, "No, child. I'm just someone who stayed seated and made the world notice." That was her gift. She didn't demand space. She revealed the consequences of being denied it. She didn't shout for attention. She forced the silence to answer for itself. And in the end, Rosa did not change the world with force, but with presence. She showed a nation what it means to live fully, love deeply, serve quietly, and still be worthy of standing ovations long after the crowd has gone home. Because some stories don't need sequels, they just need to be remembered. And Rosa Williams, whether on a battlefield or a plain seat marked 2 amperes, will be remembered by those who know that respect is not given because of what you hold, but because of who you've been. Every quiet mile along the way. Some stories do not end when the screen fades to black. They echo, they linger in the heart, asking quiet questions long after the noise has passed. Rosa's story is one of those. She didn't stand to fight. She didn't shout. She didn't demand. She simply stayed. And in that stillness, she reminded us all that true strength doesn't always look like resistance. Sometimes it seems like a presence, quiet, steady, unshakable. She didn't need anyone to give her worth. She already had it. What she wanted, what we all want, was something far more human. To be seen, to be valued, to be remembered not for what we demanded, but for how we lived. In a world rushing to forget, Rosa asked us to remember. And so we ask you now, who are the Rosas in your life? Who has given quietly, waited patiently, and stood tall without recognition? Whose story have you left unspoken? Tell us. Share their name. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Because when we speak their names, we keep their legacy alive. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something real, something worth holding on to, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the following story that matters, because this is more than just a video. This is a place for voices that deserve to be heard. And if you believe the world needs more stories like Rosa's stories that heal, stories that teach, stories that last, share this one. Pass it forward. Let someone else feel what you're feeling right now. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. We'll be here with the following story soon. Until then, stay kind, stay awake, and never forget, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply not move.